Welcome back. Thanks for staying on board. John McGinnis with you, as are Robert Buccola, managing partner at Buccola, Dreyer Babbage Buccola et al., and his associate, Robert Nelsen, both attorneys, both experts in terms of coverage for property owners and businesses. What prompted my interest in this is we've heard about the horrific events in Baltimore, and you see graphic images of buildings literally in flames in some cases, grand looting taking place, destruction, all sorts of things. And news that at some points we've heard reports that none of these businesses will be protected by their insurance coverage. First of all, I want to drill down and get the real information, and then what people ought to know about that, and how likely, how foreseeable is it, based upon the area in which a piece of property happens to rest, that it's going to be confronted with that kind of activity, and what I mean, is it any kind of vandalism, or does it have to be an act of civil unrest? What is it that provides the exclusion, and what can people do about it?
Well, first of all...
By the way, welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for being here.
Always great to be here. Well, first of all, it depends upon the type of loss that we're dealing with. And your first question was, how can you pinpoint an area that might be victimized? Believe me, there are underwriters sitting in some room somewhere that know high concentration, high-risk areas. I mean, let's face it, the downtown Carmel area is less likely than certain urban areas of Chicago, for example. So, right. But most policies do have coverage. Commercial policies do have coverage for riot and unrest. Now, many have exclusions, but the reality is that for businesses and buildings that are mortgaged, banks require that type of coverage, and there's always a rider or an endorsement you can get for it, for sure.
With that, so if you talk about the building being mortgaged, which is probably the vast majority, so there would be a requirement in the mortgage itself,
right,
for such coverage. But what about the inventory?
Well, inventory is almost always covered, as long as you have a covered peril. Now, for example, if it was due to earthquake and there was no earthquake insurance or coverage, it's not going to be covered. But if there's a covered peril, and as I said, most policies, commercial policies, do provide riot unrest coverage. Now, the exclusionary language in the prohibition for coverage has been sanctioned for 150 years. It was post-Civil War insurance-related legislation that was enacted that says, look, when we have a government turmoil, we have unrest, we have mass calamity, we need to protect these insurance companies. So they allowed for the exclusion. But most policies are written around the exclusion. And certainly any proprietor can purchase such a rider if they want to do so. The key is they have to know about it, and they have to get information from their broker, and they have to have considered it. And most people haven't. That's the problem.
Yeah, it occurs to me, and I'll plead guilty to this. Most of us, when we purchase insurance, you look at what you have to have, what you reasonably have to have, what you believe you have to have,
right,
what may be per se required by the mortgage carrier, or in the case of a car, by the Department of Motor Vehicles and the whoever holds the note on the car. But in reality, unlike so many other areas, where professional advice is typically sought after something horrible has happened. Why not? Why do we not engage in the practice of soliciting input prior to that event? Robert, what do you think?
That's a good question.
Has anybody ever called either of you and said, hey, look, I'm buying a business. What kind of coverage should I have? Would you review this policy before the bad stuff happens?
If they've had a reason to encounter us, or if it's a family friend, then certainly that those people will contact us. But unfortunately, a lot of the times we find out when it's too late. Just like you're discussing, we deal with a lot of auto policies and have to tell a lot of people they're underinsured, they don't have enough coverage, but usually the damage is already done.
I think that's a big part of it. Is I think the same thing's true with probably accountants and physicians and others, where if you seek out counsel before the bad stuff happens. But the word got out on this, that and I don't know if it's become a media hype snowball, that so many people would not be covered, so many owners of businesses would not be covered. But it sounds as though it's your estimation that there are probably more that will be covered, more that are covered than those who won't be.
Yeah, and the insurance industry spokespersons have indicated that the greatest majority will be covered. When you said, what can somebody do? The reality is, first of all, hire a really competent broker. If you're a business owner, and send a letter or an email saying, Dear Mr. Broker, I'm concerned about perils that may not be covered. What additional coverages would you recommend that I consider obtaining given the type of business, given my area, given my locale? Put put the ball in the broker's court to go through some of that stuff with you. And, of course, as an owner, you really should read the policy. You know, they used to be impossible to read or understand, but about 25 years ago in California, we went to an easy reader format by legislation. And you really can read and get at least inquiry notice going for yourself to ask questions about things you see that you don't think might suit your purposes. So you have to ask those questions for sure.
And what about now? When we talk about what happened in Baltimore, that's a case of civil disorder. It's a unique set of circumstances. So a person who owns a business in Granite Bay, El Dorado Hills, and they don't. I mean, they're not likely to encounter that kind of activity. However, you may have some bored high school kids that think vandalism is a good exercise in which to engage, and they go vandalize and destroy a property in that scenario. Would there be an exclusion for that?
No, and Robert, you can talk about riot exclusion versus vandalism, if you would.
Yeah, there's a lot of case law that actually makes this distinction, and they refer to the common law rule for the definition of a riot, which is a tumultuous disturbance of the peace by a group of 3 or more persons having a common purpose who act in concert to accomplish their purpose through force or violence.
Okay.
Essentially, you need 3 or more people, but the main objective is this a public display? Are they sending a message? And if not, then that's vandalism. That's something that's treated differently, and sometimes there will be exclusions for that, but fortunately, a lot of carriers are contracting around that too.
I always hate the thought of good, well-intentioned people who take risks, who invest in things, missing out because they didn't have adequate coverage. And so coming up, I want to ask you guys more specific questions as to how to address that and how people can rest assured that they actually have proper coverage. What kind of things to look for in terms of legal risks associated with your investments. All that coming up on KFBK. Don't go away. Welcome back. Thanks for staying on board. John McGinnis with you, as are Robert Buccola and Robert Nelsen, 2 Roberts from Driver, Babbage, Buccola, Wood, and Campora. I got everybody in there, right, Bob?
You did.
All right. And this is preventative medicine because as we go about the business of buying insurance policies, just sending the check in does not take care of all the potential challenges that could befall you. And why not have an element of knowledge that you can employ before the crisis hits? And it's not just a matter of checking the box to make sure you have it. So what kinds of things should people know and be mindful of? How do you take the steps? How onerous is it? Are they going to spend a bunch of money researching to make sure they have the right policy, or is there a simple solution to do it?
There really are simple solutions once you know, and start off with a good broker and ask the right questions. I like to see them at least initially begin in writing. But for example, in a commercial setting, which we've been talking about here following the Baltimore losses, there are a number of types of perils that people would expect to be covered that aren't. For example, typically commercial glass is not covered. You have to buy a separate endorsement. The endorsements are not expensive, but if your broker doesn't tell you that, and you've got a storefront building and you've got expensive glass, and glass is extraordinarily expensive, it's a great coverage to have. Another one is business interruption insurance. You know, if you're shut down because of a covered calamity, you're going to need to make payroll and do all that other stuff in the 6 or 8 or 10 months you're down. Make sure you have the coverage. One really important coverage that's overlooked is employee embezzlement coverage, and it's defined within the policy. But with these big companies, it's amazing how often $1,000 a month goes out the door, or 2 or 3 or 4, and it's discovered on year 5 after there's been embezzlement of well into 6 figures. Those kinds of losses can be covered under policies. And the premiums are remarkably small for these endorsements. And there's a multitude of other areas where losses are common.
Good to know. And so I like the idea. You mentioned this twice, that you communicate with your broker in writing. So either via email or paper, old style, just to have an understanding and a commitment, a buy-in to the extent that this is what the coverage provides.
Right.
And some of these issues you mentioned, if it's not addressed specifically in the policy, do you want to make sure it's covered by virtue of an endorsement? Would it go that far? Or
well, here's the reason I think you want to communicate in writing. First of all, it sets the stage for your in-person meeting and say, here's the kind of business I run. Here are my concerns. What are your thoughts? It's not so much to document you've put the ball in his or her court, but it allows for good dialogue so they can go through the available endorsements to you. I mean, if one of the endorsements is a flood coverage, but you're at the highest piece of property anywhere in the area and there's not a body of water anywhere and it never rains, that's kind of a silly coverage to have.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of dialogue you can go ahead and have. And some things you cannot you can't write around exclusions for. You can't insure for intentional acts. There are a number of things you can't insure for against public policy. But most things you can find a carrier that will provide a rider that will extend the coverage that would otherwise be excluded. And as Robert's research has shown many, many times, most of these exclusions are held valid if they're clear and understandable by the insured at the time the policy is entered.
What about, we talk about commercial properties in particular, and I got to tell you, when I saw the devastation and heard the information and read articles that specifically said that the majority of these people would not be covered, I had tremendous empathy for them. It's reassuring for me to know that that's probably not the case.
Well, and understand, saying not be covered, some may not be covered for their glass loss.
Yeah.
Some may not be covered for their business interruption. A few may not be covered at all, even for the property damage, if in fact there was a valid riot exclusion. Remember, don't worry about the 5 or 6 or 8 kids in your neighborhood that vandalize. You're going to be covered there. It's if it's for a common purpose, public demonstration, that type of thing, which, of course, arose out of the death of Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray, right. So, again, many of these people will have losses that will not be covered by insurance, but the vast majority of their losses certainly should be in this setting.
And what about the same thought process for homeowners insurance and even auto insurance? What kinds of things that I'm sure you see cases in which people neglected to have the proper coverage and pay an enormous price or lose out on something that they just assumed was covered because fine print is so easy to overlook. What kind of things, just advice can you offer people as they go about? If somebody chooses to not be insured, they make a foolish mistake, I think. But if you go to the extent, go through the pain and actually commit financially to an insurance policy in the good faith belief that you're going to be covered, and then you find out you're not, that can be an extraordinary hit. And some people it could put out of business or put them in a position where they can't continue with their standard of life. So what kinds of things do you recommend people specifically look for, either in home, auto, commercial, whatever the case may be?
Well, I think the take-home point here is really read your policy. Can't stress that enough. It is laid out in a pretty straightforward manner. It'll say, here's what's covered, here's what's not covered. Those exclusions, you really need to understand the ramifications associated with it because they are consistently upheld through the courts. So, the case law dates back to the Civil War and, fires that stem from Allied versus rebel combat. So, this is it's really no way of overcoming that. So reading your policy, understanding it. If you have questions, go to your broker, ask for those ambiguities to be clarified, and then you go from there.
Well, two tidbits of good news I take out of this. One, overwhelmingly, to my way of thinking, I find it reassuring that it's not as stark for those people who invested in Baltimore as we may have been led to believe. While there may be some exclusions, they're probably going to be rare. Probably those businesses who are encumbered by a mortgage absolutely will have appropriate coverage. And even if the broken glass, for example, in the grand scheme of things, they can endure that and they can probably get back into the hopes of making a living. The other is that you can take reasonable steps. And I appreciate the fact we got 2 lawyers on the program who don't say you have to call an attorney to make sure you have adequate coverage. You can actually deal with an honest broker and make sure you get those concerns addressed. And, of course, it's advisable to do it in writing. I suppose anytime it's wise to seek out those questions in writing, maintain a copy of that correspondence. And if you've asked for it and it's been addressed and you've been assured in exchange for compensation that you're going to be covered, then that's when you guys would go to work and make sure that justice prevails if there's a challenge or a threat, right?
Right. And listen, one thing that's important, and your listeners should take this to the bank, if you're looking for a primer about what to do in the homeowner setting or the auto setting, remember this. Whatever insurance coverage you have for liability protection or uninsured motorist coverage, and that is coverage that you get when somebody negligently injures you that has either no insurance or inadequate insurance, it's peanuts, the difference between what somebody will pay for $50,000 in coverage and $300,000 in coverage. Umbrellas for most good drivers, up to $1 million may cost a couple $100 a year, $180 a year. So really ask your agent or your broker what you can get in terms of greater coverages in those very critical areas for a little bit more money. People don't realize it. They pay more under their auto policy for glass coverage and fire to their auto than they do bodily injury protection because insurance companies pay out a lot more on fire to cars and glass and stolen vehicles than they do on personal injury cases. But if you're the one that's being sued because you ran a red light and someone's been to the med center and the medical bill's $1 million, you're going to wish you had that higher coverage.
Great information, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Brilliant attorneys, Bob Buccola, Robert Nelsen from Dreyer, Babbage, Buccola, Wood, Campora. I got them all.
You
got
did.
them all. All right.
You did.
Hey, coming up, we're going to talk more about this Day of Giving and what it means. And Sacramento has distinguished itself. This region has incredible stuff. In fact, by the time these guys make their donations, I'm sure we're going to clear that $5 million threshold.